Well, good evening. I'm Wendy Luget, the University Librarian, and it's wonderful to see all of you this evening for a very special evening. We've anticipated it with great joy to celebrate our dear friends, Joanne and Paul Nagel, in this first lecture series in their honor. We'll be hearing tonight from noted historian, art historian Humphrey Adams, who's also a descendant of two of Paul's favorite subjects, our second and fifth presidents, John Adams and John Quincy Adams. But to begin tonight's program, I'd like to introduce Eric Black, a longtime reporter for the Star Tribune and also a well-known blogger, currently for MinnPost. And Eric primarily writes about politics and historical background of current events, which, as you might imagine, afforded Paul and Eric the opportunity to have many a discussion together, and a spirited discussion at that, I'm sure. So we thought we'd start with a first-hand account of these debates, and please join me in welcoming Eric Black.
Thank you. Is my tie straight? Paul Nagel's son Eric contacted me a few days ago to express his regrets that he couldn't be here tonight, nor either of his brothers, and asked me to greet you on behalf of the boys, and he's sorry that he couldn't be here. I assume the audience has a lot of people in it that knew Paul very well, and maybe some that didn't. But those of you that were around for the last days of Paul's life know that Eric Nagel basically moved into the situation and took care of his dad at the end, and was simply heroic. And I just want to say it in front of a large group of people, how heroic he was and how lucky anybody would be to get that kind of care at the end. Well, the Friends of the Library has a lot of friends, and so did Paul Nagel have a lot of friends, and I was fortunate to be one of them. He had so many distinguished friends, and probably some less distinguished, that I'm particularly honored to be asked to speak on the occasion of the first Nagel Lecture. Although over the years of our friendship, I heard a few previous Nagel Lectures. I want to talk about Paul as a friend, which is what he was to me. He was the kind of a friend who came through for his friends. He made you feel good about yourself. I sometimes felt he was on a small campaign to make sure I thought of much of myself as he thought of me. He promoted my work to his large circle of friends. He would make them read my articles. He would extract compliments from them and then pass them along to me. It was embarrassing, but overall kind of pleasant. Paul loved life, and most things about it, as far as I could tell. He loved to eat, despite managing to stay thin somehow. He liked to drink beer, and I remember one of the last times that he and I went out together was to a beer tasting at it's called the Campus Club, the faculty club at the U of M. He was, of course, a world-class historian, and there's probably people here who know that better than I do, but as I say, I wanted to talk about him as a person, an individual that I came to know during the last 10 or more years of his life and miss very much. He was one of the most devoted husbands I've ever seen. And the way he took care of his beloved, Joanne, during the last days of her life was downright inspiring. Paul loved to walk. One of the things he loved about Minneapolis was the Skyway system because it enabled him to walk all winter long, and he liked long walks. And he was even willing, after we became friends, to walk from the what would it be, the southwest corner of the Skyway system where he lived, to the northeast corner of the Skyway system, which was nearest to the Star Tribune, to have lunch with me. And I miss those lunches. I miss his enthusiasm about almost everything, and I miss those compliments that he used to dragoon out of his friends for me. I never really knew quite what I had done to be taken so deeply into the embrace of his friendship. Maybe part of it was that when he shared his historical insights with me, as he often did, I could put them in the paper. I quoted him many times. Newspaper reporters are supposed to be objective, and especially so about the people they quote. But I wasn't objective about Paul. It's too late for the Strib to fire me over that. He was, however, a reporter's dream. He was the kind of a person who, as reporters like to say, gave good quote. Since Mr. Adams is here, I would like him to know that his family and Paul's longstanding interest in everything to do with his family was the origin of our friendship. Anybody remember the Bush-Gore election of 2000? So I write a lot about politics, but I take special pleasure in putting things into historical context. And of course, George W. Bush was the second son of a president to become president, and John Quincy Adams was the first. So there were all these Bush-Adams comparisons that could be passed off as news that year. And it came to my attention that one of the, if not the leading Adams historian in the world was living in town, and that's how we got acquainted. And so I just wanted to give you a taste of the kind of insights that Paul provided to me on that, in that semi-professional capacity. Here's the example. There were a number of interesting similarities and differences between the second Adams and the second Bush. One of the similarities was that they both suffered from what you might call a tainted mandate. Neither of them finished first in the popular vote in the year that they ran for president. Bush needed the Supreme Court to make him president, and John Quincy Adams needed the House of Representatives to make him president. He had finished behind Andrew Jackson in that election. Nobody got a majority of the electoral votes in the year that Quincy Adams and Jackson ran, and the Constitution requires that in such a case, the decision on the presidency be made in the House of Representatives. And the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who had run for president but hadn't made the cut to be considered for president in the House, because he finished fourth, supported Adams and used his influence to help Adams get elected in the House. And Adams was elected in the House with Clay's help. So I was just going to read you a few paragraphs from one of my umpteen stories quoting Paul about that matter, just to stick a little historical substance into my personal recollections. And this is what the story said. Clay and Adams did meet before the House voted. Clay did help tip the House to vote for Adams. And Adams did name Clay as Secretary of State, then considered the stepping stone to the presidency. Adams' biographer Paul Nagel of Minneapolis says that no reliable account of the Clay-Adams meeting survives, and he has reached no conclusion about whether the two may have cut a deal, although he thinks not. And here's the quote. But it's as clear as it can be that within minutes after Adams had been chosen by the House, the Jacksonians began howling that their candidate had been robbed of the presidency as the result of a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. And they kept it up for 4 years and beyond to great effect, Nagel said. The Jacksonian Party, which became the modern Democratic Party, was born on that day. So if you want some relevance, this is the origin of really what we continue to call the Democratic Party in America. Well, Paul, we miss you. The good part is we're talking about you. We're telling stories, we're talking about history, we're talking about the Adamses, we're thinking about you, and we're smiling. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. That was wonderful. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate Paul and Joanne Nagel for their mutual contributions to history. They're bringing history alive for all of us, I think. And if you'll indulge me a little of my own personal reflection, when I first came to the university in 2002, I remember an event celebrating the opening of Walter Library. Hundreds of people, throngs everywhere, and they were all strangers, of course, to me. I knew not a one. And amidst the crowds, Paul and Joanne just literally appeared in front of me to make their welcomes known, to make a connection, and that connection was sustained certainly for the rest of their lives. Librarian, genealogist, and historian Paul and Joanne were a wonderful duo, each reinforcing each other's work, and both of them deeply committed to libraries and the role libraries play within the academy, but also the broader community. They both worked tirelessly to further our Friends organization, offering counsel ranging from a specific event that we might hold to thinking about the strategic directions of the library going forward. Their commitment was boundless, as was their network and their Rolodex, which we benefited so handsomely from. They brought us many speakers, and many friends in their broad network came to be part of our friends group as well. We are honored tonight to have as an inaugural speaker a distinguished art historian, Henry Adams. In addition to sharing the common bond of scholarship and of intimate interests in the Addams presidencies, Paul Nagel and Henry Adams have a few other similarities as well. Each has written about the Missouri painter George Caleb Bingham, and Dr. Adams has written on Thomas Hart Benton, about whom he has produced an acclaimed PBS documentary in partnership with Ken Burns. As an expert in American painting, focusing principally on American artists of the 19th and early 20th century, Dr. Adams has also written about Thomas Cole, Winslow Homer, Jackson Pollock, and David Hockney, to name a few. His books never fail to evoke thoughtful discussion and sometimes controversy. Of his book, Eakins Remembered, art historian Robert Rosenblum said, "It possesses the page-turning momentum of a detective story," while painter Andrew Wyeth proclaimed it without a doubt the most extraordinary biography. Graduate of Harvard, Dr. Adams received his master's and PhD at Yale, where he received the Francis Blanchard Prize for Best Doctoral Dissertation in Art History. Throughout his career, he's received numerous awards, served as a curator at numerous museums, including the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh and the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, and produced nearly 250 publications in American field, including scholarly and popular articles and books and catalogs, exhibitions, you name it. He is currently professor of art history at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. A review of his most recent publication, Tom and Jack, The Intertwined Lives of Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock. The review tells us that Adams practices art history with a novelist's narrative skills and psychological acuity, and a sleuth's instinct and a passion for aesthetic and technical explications. And I think those of us who knew Paul might say that this passage captures a kind of similar description of some of his writings as well, so they have something else in common. We're really pleased tonight to welcome Dr. Henry Adams for this inaugural lecture.
Thanks very much, and thank all of you for coming tonight to honor Paul Nagel. Just a little less than a year ago, on November 26th, I had the honor of presenting to Paul Nagel the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Addams Institute, which has honored only two other people in the course of its existence, David McCullough and Senator Edward Kennedy. At that point, I hadn't seen Paul since the death of my father in 1998, but it was as though no time had passed away, because as any of you who knew Paul can testify, he had a wonderful gift for friendship and for sympathetically connecting with other people, and he was a very good listener. While Paul clearly was in mourning over the recent death of his wife, Joan, he seemed perfectly healthy and intellectually vital, and I looked forward to renewing his acquaintance. I had him inscribe some books, and I looked forward to having him meet my son Tommy and my wife face-to-face, which he had never done. It's a bit of a shock to realize that he's now gone, although of course it's a pleasure to speak about him and his work, which I'll do from a particular and personal perspective. Paul Nagel has had several successful careers and would rank as one of the great American historians of this in the last century if he had never written about the Addams family. He had a long and successful career as a university professor, as well as an academic administrator, serving as dean at the University of Kentucky and then moving to the University of Missouri, where he served as provost and vice president, thus becoming really the figure who had the most powerful impact on the intellectual life of the university, since these days usually the university president is primarily a fundraiser. To continue, as if this weren't enough, Paul Nagel has also written an impressive number of fine books on American history, including two books on the ideology of American nationalism, One Nation, Indivisible, and This Sacred Trust. He wrote a study of the Lee family of Virginia, a history of the state of Missouri, a history of German migration to the state of Missouri, and a history of the first major painter to work west of the Mississippi, George Caleb Bingham. Nonetheless, I think it's safe to say that it's as a chronicler of the Addams family that Paul Nagel achieved his greatest achievements. Descent from Glory, which, as I recall, hit the bestseller list, and this coupled with two other books on the Addams family, The Addams Women, and most recently John Quincy Adams, cover the family with a depth and from a range of perspectives that have not been equaled by any other historians. So I'll concentrate this evening on Paul's writings on the Addams family. And to start, I think it may be helpful to say a few words about the family itself and the figures who played a distinguished role in American politics and cultural life for four successive generations. And I should note that Paul was always helped in his research by his wife, Joan, who was trained both as a librarian and as a genealogist. Who were the Addams family? Where did they come from? How did they rise from prominence? What were their achievements, and what were the foundation of their notable role in American politics and cultural life? Can we speak of an Addams family tradition or viewpoint, and if so, what does it consist of? Dealing with some of these questions will provide a foundation for indicating what was unique about Paul Nagel's contribution as a historian of the family. Of course, I'm a member of the Addams family, 6 generations down from John Adams, and while for most people what the Addams did belongs to the distant past, to me there's a sort of immediacy that's connected with my childhood that makes the whole history of the Addams family very immediate. To give you a sense of this, let me show you a photograph of my grandfather, John Adams, standing next to a bust of John Adams, the president, and I think you'll be struck by the resemblance. In fact, the bust of John Adams is clearly somewhat idealized, so that you have the sense that in real life he would have looked even more similar to my grandfather. And here you can see both of them next to John Quincy Adams, Genetically short of cloning, it hardly seems possible to have family members who look so much alike for one generation after another. But for some reason, all the Adamses looked alike. Here's my father, Thomas Boylston Adams. You can see that the Adams look is starting to soften a bit, but he certainly had the fierce expression down quite nicely. For whatever reason, when I was born, it broke the mold, and there's no longer such a strong resemblance. But having spent my childhood with my father and grandfather, who looked nearly identical to John and John Quincy Adams, in some curious way, I feel that I know what the members of the Addams family were like in earlier centuries. I got to know the tribe. And I might add that I think that one of Paul Nagel's sneaky little tricks as a historian was that he took the trouble to get to know the living members of the Addams family, much as if he was studying some exotic primitive tribe in the Amazon jungle. He knew that there was some tribal quality to the Addams family that was distinctive, and like a good anthropologist, he set out to investigate that. Here a bit of a family footnote is in order. In the heyday of his early success, my great-grandfather, Charles Francis Adams, was head of the Union Pacific Railroad and very rich. He had a big house and a big estate in Lincoln with something like 14 servants. But the wheel of fortune turns, and by the time of his death, he was completely busted. The grand mansion was torn down because the family couldn't afford the taxes. And at that point, an interesting regression occurred, rather as of a species that were to evolve backwards to an earlier state, as if mammals were to go back to being dinosaurs or something of that sort. And essentially, the family went back to a sort of primitive rural life, which was not that different from the 18th century. My grandfather lived in an 18th century farmhouse with a big brick fireplace and oven in which he cooked and baked bread from cornmeal. And it's not that different from the birthplace of John and John Quincy Adams. And the family grew vegetables like their early American forebears. They did farm work with horses. My father rode his pony to school. And here's another sort of rural scene. They refrigerated food with ice, which they cut each winter from the pond. So to a remarkable extent, they not only looked like the 18th century Adamses, but they lived a life which was quite similar to that of the 18th century. And while by the time I grew up, modern life was starting to creep in, knowing my father and my grandfather, you could see 18th century attitudes that had persisted into the present. To describe the Addams family briefly is not easy. To outsiders, the Adamses have often seemed difficult and unreasonable, while the Adamses from John on down have always felt that they were unfairly maligned, and this often put them in a grumpy mood, which confirmed the suspicions of those who did not like them. Perhaps their saving grace was that for 4 generations, they were not only active in political affairs, but were prolific scribblers who recorded seemingly their every thought about every issue that passed in front of them. The combined Addams papers take up 608 reels, or more than 5 miles of microfilm. And while I don't have an exact figure for the length of the actual Addams papers, I think particularly if you took some scissors to them, they would stretch from here to California. Seemingly all the Adamses liked to write, and they seldom agreed with each other. Indeed, not only the famous ones liked to write, but the wives and brothers and sisters and brothers of wives and first cousins and so forth also liked to write, creating a web of documentation which creates a kind of 4-generation family argument that has no equal in American history, and indeed seems to have no counterpart in England or Europe either. Since there are at least 7 major figures in the Addams family, their names and relationships easily become confusing, particularly since one of the qualities of being an Addams was that there were very few possibilities for names. If you were male, you were generally called either John, John Quincy, Charles, Thomas, or Henry. And if you were female, you were called Abigail or Susanna. Susanna coming from John Adams's mother, Susanna Boylston, from the distinguished Boylston family, which were much more socially of higher status in the 18th century than the Adamses were. When you map out the whole clan, these names often alternate in quite a confusing way. Notably, in my great-grandfather's generation, when the brother named John named his eldest son Charles Francis, and the brother named Charles Francis named his eldest son John. Not surprisingly, it's easy to get members of the family mixed up. And for example, if you check the biography that's attached to my books on Amazon, you'll find an extremely impressive listing of my varied achievements, followed by the revelation that I died in 1918. And needless to say, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. The family history essentially starts from zero in 1637, when the first American Adams, Henry Adams, came to the United States and settled in Braintree, a few miles south of Boston. Since the name Adams is fairly common, the family genealogy can't be traced back with assurance before that point. We don't know exactly where Henry Adams came from, and we know almost nothing about him except that he had some old books in his estate at the time of his death, something slightly unusual when most families only owned a single book, the Bible. For 3 generations, Henry Adams's descendants farmed the land around Braintree and Quincy, often serving honorably in small civic posts such as town selectmen, but without achieving anything notable of historical significance. Then at the time of the American Revolution, the family emerged from obscurity. John Adams was the first Adams to emerge from obscurity. The key to his later success was that he went to college, which at that time meant going to Harvard. To finance this, his father, who was a small farmer, also named John, did something he had never done before and never did again. He sold 10 acres of land from the precious family farm to cover the cost of tuition. John Adams's legal career began quite inauspiciously with the case about a stray horse that he lost through a technicality by drawing up a defective writ. It has sometimes occurred to me that his later achievements, and by extension perhaps those of all the other members of the family, may have been an attempt to compensate for the excruciating embarrassment he felt on this occasion. Humiliated, he resolved to never again make an error of this sort, and within a few years he'd become the most successful lawyer in Massachusetts, taking on cases of every sort. He defended poor debtors, horse thieves, and smugglers, not always successfully. And as a lawyer, he traveled from Martha's Vineyard to Maine to Worcester, all this at a time when traveling to Worcester often meant saddling up a horse and riding there. His appetite for work was seemingly endless. In 1772, he appeared in more than 200 Superior Court cases. Rather like figures like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates today, John Adams saw something sooner and more clearly about the dawn of a new era in human history. He saw that America could become an independent nation, and he also saw that it could be founded on principles of law, of fundamental human rights, and democratic governance, and provide a new model for human society. He saw this significantly ahead of anyone else, and in many ways, he saw this more clearly. Trained as a lawyer, he became actively involved in the agitation against British taxation and wrote pamphlets about government and the British abuse of the American colonies. The Declaration of Independence is probably John's single greatest achievement. Elected to the Continental Congress, he was the chief mover for such a declaration. He was then appointed American Commissioner to France, and while in Europe arranged for Holland to recognize the United States and to make significant financial loans to the American cause. As ambassador to Holland, he became the first ambassador of the United States. He went on in partnership with Jefferson and Franklin to negotiate the treaty that ended the American Revolution and brought peace with England, and after the treaty, he served as the first American ambassador to England. Returning to the United States, he was elected the first vice president under Washington, and after Washington's retirement, was elected president. While generally considered prickly, pompous, and ungenerous, and sometimes faulted for his judgment about whom to trust, John Adams was responsible for what are arguably the three best political appointments in American history. It was John Adams who arranged for George Washington to be appointed commander-in-chief. It was John Adams who arranged for Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence, and it was he who arranged for John Marshall to become Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. While often faulted for his vanity, he made these appointments fully aware that the future would give these men credit for initiatives which would never have been launched without his efforts. John Adams was also a thinker. In the course of this service, he actively spoke and wrote about the principles of governments and was largely responsible for the system of checks and balances, which is the basis of American government, the separation of the legislative and executive branches, and the separation of both from the judiciary. The Constitution he wrote for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is the oldest functioning written constitution in the world and serves as the principal model for the Constitution of the United States. Throughout these efforts, Adams was actively supported by his wife, Abigail Adams, who is one of the most remarkable women in American history, and of whom I'll say more shortly. Adams's oldest son, John Quincy, also pursued a distinguished career in government, starting at the age of 13 when he became a translator for the American ambassador to Russia. He went on to serve as ministers to the Netherlands and Prussia, as United States Senator, as Harvard professor, minister to Russia and Great Britain, and finally as Secretary of State under James Monroe, where he proved one of the most effective secretaries of state in American history and framed one of the classic statements of American diplomacy, the so-called Monroe Doctrine. After this, he was elected President of the United States, a position he did not enjoy very much, and which ended in his defeat by Andrew Jackson. But perhaps his most impressive years were his last ones, when, against the advice of his friends who thought the position beneath him, he served in the United States Congress for 20 years, where he became the most vigorous advocate against the extension of slavery. Still active as a lawyer, he also took on the case and won the legal freedom of the slaves who had revolted and captured the slave ship Amistad, a story dramatized not long ago in a movie by Steven Spielberg. Active to his last day, he died of a stroke in the midst of a session in Congress, as far as I recall, the only man who ever has done so. John Quincy Adams' son, Charles Francis Adams, served in the Massachusetts legislature and was an unsuccessful vice presidential candidate on the Free Soil Party, which opposed the extension of slavery. His greatest contribution, however, came when he was appointed ambassador to Great Britain by Abraham Lincoln. Here he played a major role in an episode that's now nearly forgotten, but that could have utterly changed the history of the United States, the role of Great Britain during the Civil War. At the beginning of the Civil War, public opinion in England favored the Confederacy. If England, with its invincible navy, had intervened in the conflict, it surely would have led to the defeat of the Union and the dissolution of the United States. Adams arrived in England with a tiny diplomatic staff and a few English supporters and patiently set out to turn the tide of public opinion. And amazingly, he was successful in this. And here I'm showing Charles Francis Adams next to his father, John Quincy. Again, I think the family resemblance is fascinating. The aftermath of the war brought Charles Francis another diplomatic triumph. Early in the war, the English had allowed a Confederate raider, the Alabama, to be constructed in Liverpool, and it had sunk over 50 American merchant ships. The United States sued the English government for damages, and Adams was sent to Geneva to negotiate the American claims. The turning point of the negotiations came when the English representative cited a legal precedent but confused his facts. Adams nailed him on the point which favored the American case. And since the English themselves cited the precedent, it was hard for them to maintain that it did not apply. In the end, the United States collected over $15 million in damages, which was a staggering sum at the time, and by far the largest international settlement which had been awarded up to that date. It's at this point that the family lineage becomes rather confusing, for Charles Francis Adams had 4 sons, 3 of whom achieved historical distinction. One of these was the eldest son, my great-grandfather, Charles Francis Adams, Jr., who served with distinction in the American Civil War, and then went on to write exposés of the financial corruption of the time, introducing a forceful new style of political journalism that later became known as muckraking. And one of the causes of his discussed was the issue of public safety on the part of railroads. Due to his efforts, Massachusetts set up a government entity to guard public safety on railroads, and Charles was appointed to direct it. This was the first government regulatory commission in the United States. Charles soon became tired, however, of regulating things from a distance and plunged into finance himself. During a turbulent business career, he occupied a number of powerful positions, including head of the Union Pacific Railroad and director of the Kansas City Stockyards. The youngest brother, Brooks, was a brilliant, slightly skewed, and rather humorless man who wrote stunningly pessimistic books about the madness of capitalism and the inevitability of social decline, including a volume with the wonderfully gloomy title, The Law of Civilization and Decay. And finally, there was the most distinguished member of this generation, Henry Adams, who was one of the most mysterious and enigmatic figures in American life. Always somewhat retiring, Henry Adams nonetheless pursued a distinguished career as professor of American history at Harvard, where he introduced the one great innovation in American teaching since the 18th century, the seminar method, by which rather than memorizing by rote, students learned through active discussion and questions. Ironically, his innovative course of that time on Anglo-Saxon law is now the oldest course that has been continuously taught in the Harvard College catalog. And while professing to be uninterested in politics, he was the close friend of John Hay, who was the Secretary of State for McKinley and Roosevelt. And he seems to have played a significant role in it, shaping from sort of a background position American foreign policy. Henry Adams's greatest achievement, however, was a book he wrote in his late 60s, The Education of Henry Adams, in which he deplored his own failure, as well as that of others in his generation, to fully comprehend the powerful discoveries of modern science and the powerful forces of modern technology. Published after his death, the book became a surprise posthumous bestseller, and while few books have been so roundly criticized for being unsatisfactory, and few authors so frequently dismissed as failures, a few years ago, in a poll of American intellectuals, it was ranked as the greatest American nonfiction book of the 20th century. The fact that all these notable hard-driving figures appeared in so many generations is surely a peculiar phenomenon. And in seeking to explain this, I think we need to turn to John Adams's wife, Abigail, who was surely the single most remarkable figure in the Addams family and one of the most remarkable American women of the 18th century, if not of any period. Interestingly, when John Adams first met Abigail Smith in the summer of 1759, he compared her unfavorably to a previous girlfriend and declared that she was neither fond nor frank nor candid. But he soon learned to swallow these words. They were married when she was just short of 20. He was 29. And Abigail later lamented her lack of formal education, but in her letters this lack of formal training becomes a virtue. And the wonderful thing about her letters is that the way they move naturally and unself-consciously from expressions of love to discourses on politics or political theory, to the latest news about the American Revolution, to gossip about the neighbors, and so forth. And I think what's extraordinary is their directness, so that we almost feel as though we're eavesdropping on an 18th century conversation. And in 1976, when her letters and those of John were anthologized, they became a surprise bestseller. There are over 1,000 letters that they exchanged with each other, of which only half have been published so far. Loosely speaking, I think Abigail can be credited with 3 achievements. One is that she guided all of John Adams's major decisions and helped to shape his thinking. And if John Adams's notable achievement was to defend principles of human rights and democratic governance, it's notable that in her letters, Abigail always expressed these principles more forcefully and articulately than he did. John Adams was the only one of the founding fathers who did not own slaves, and Abigail's letters contained fascinating passages not only proposing the abolition of slavery, but also the most notable statements made by anyone in the 18th century about the notion that women should have legal rights equal to men. Abigail was also a brilliant businesswoman and manager, and John Adams, after his father's death, basically inherited 40 acres of land and a small farmhouse. By the end of his life, he owned more than 600 acres, which was fully 10 times what he had started with, and his estate was worth about $100,000, which isn't easy to put into contemporary values, but is probably equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. By the standards of the European nobility, he was never a wealthy man. There's a French visitor who commented rather sniffily that his house wouldn't even be the summer home of a Parisian lawyer. But for someone who had started out with relatively little, it was a significant accomplishment. And Thomas Jefferson, for example, who started with 20 times John Adams's inheritance, died with debts which were slightly larger than the value of John Adams's estate. John Adams himself was an energetic farmer, but he was away much of the time, and it was Abigail who took on the task of running the farm and did so very effectively with exceptional business skill. The final thing is just that Abigail had a genius for raising children, and reading Abigail Adams's letters, one is struck that her principles of education are similar to those which we would find in a progressive manual today. Children should not be physically punished, but should be given constant encouragement to behave well. And the most effective form of teaching comes not through words, but by setting a good example. And one of the things that comes out in her letters, Abigail was constantly caring for children. When her own were grown, she had a seemingly endless appetite for taking on the children of other couples, her children's children, her sister's children, her friends' children, and so forth. At the same time, one of the things that's remarkable about the Addams family is the degree to which they were willing to subject their children to risk in the interest of their education. It's the tough love approach. And as a consequence, they grew up very quickly. When Quincy Adams was 10, for example, Abigail agreed to send him on a mission with a risky diplomatic mission to France. During the voyage, their ship was pursued by British warships. They nearly sunk in a storm during which the mainmast was shattered by lightning, and shortly before they reached land, a cannon exploded, killing one of the ship's officers. But despite their love for their children, John and Abigail seem to have viewed events such as this as necessary lessons in the workings of Providence and as necessary tests of character. And as Abigail wrote to her son, John Quincy, "These are the times in which a genius would choose to live. It is not in the still calm of life or the repose of a Pacific station that great characters are formed. The habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with great difficulties." And later, when John Quincy Adams was just 15, he traveled alone in winter from Moscow to Holland. And you wonder how many modern parents would allow their 15-year-old child to make such a trip. Abigail Adams is finally getting her due. This is a remarkable statement recently written by Maureen Dowd. She writes, "From Abigail Adams to Tom Sawyer to Bugs Bunny to Jimmy Stewart's Jefferson Smith to Indiana Jones, the best American character is plucky, nimble, clever, and inventive." Several things are remarkable about this statement. One is that all of these figures are characters from literature or from the movies, except for Abigail Adams, who's the only real person on the list. And she's also the only woman. And I think it is right that Abigail Adams was plucky, nimble, and inventive, and in some peculiar way cast a shadow over her children and over her children's children that had impact for successive generations. So that's a summary of the Addams family. It's obviously quite a story with fascinating, strong-willed characters set against the stage of great historical events. And what's more, it's a story that's uniquely well documented in the Addams Family papers. I think that Paul Nagel was the first historian who fully grasped the possibility of putting together these facts to write a story unparalleled in American history. And this brings us to the Addams papers themselves, without which his achievement would not have been possible. The fact that the papers finally became accessible to scholars is a little story of its own, since for decades they had remained largely off limits. After my great-grandfather's death in 1915, access to the family papers became increasingly restricted, and the family became increasingly concerned that someone might come along and do for the Adamses what Lytton Strachey had done for all those eminent Victorians. And as Samuel F. Bemis, one of the few scholars who did get limited access to this case, commented, "The family was particularly sensitive to a new school of writers seeking sensational copy to debunk great men by display of their petty human qualities. Such exhibitionists were prone to exploit human weakness rather than strength of character." In 1927, the family appointed my grandfather's identical twin, Henry Adams, to serve as trustees of the paper. And I don't have a photograph of Henry Adams, my great uncle, but he was an identical twin of my grandfather. So he clearly looked exactly the same. And in fact, this could well be a photograph of Henry Adams, and someone just mislabeled it. Anyway, Henry Adams appeared daily at the society, opened the double-locked heavy door of the Adams room, entered his treasure house, put on his black alpaca coat, and busied himself arranging the documents and reading letters of inquiry from scholars, a few of whom he assisted, but most of whom he dismissed out of hand. And he was quite deaf and also had a habit of removing his hearing aid when he didn't want to listen to people. And as Samuel Bemis reminisced, I can still picture Henry Adams coming in from Concord of a frosty winter morning, his pale blue eyes running from the cold, rubbing his hands briskly, unlocking the door, opening the window of the inner Adams sanctum, and unbolting the iron fireproof and thief-proof shutters one high story up from the ground alleyway. Sometimes he would speak to me, sometimes not. He would bring out some volume or volumes of manuscript, and he would get so absorbed in those old family letters that he would often talk to their authors. Confound it, Abigail shouldn't have said that. Or, that old man should have known better. When I once referred to the old man, Henry Adams quickly reacted. In the family, we call him that, but other people shouldn't. For several decades, scholarship on the Addams family languished. But then when Henry Adams died in 1951, my father, Thomas Boylston Adams, and he was the third Thomas Boylston Adams, took over his role as trustee, assisted by his first cousin, John Quincy Adams. And again, you can see the family's remarkable creativity with names. At this point, there was no family member on hand to serve as custodian on the papers, and also the trust in which the papers had been placed was due to run out in a few years. And so some plan had to be made for their disposition, and the trustees had freedom to do anything they wished, including selling the papers and dispersing them, which were then worth quite a lot of money, or for that matter, they could have chosen to burn them to prevent any family secrets from getting out. Assisted by Walter Muir Whitehill, who was director of the Boston Athenaeum, the two trustees assembled a distinguished advisory committee consisting of Julian Boyd, editor of the Thomas Jefferson Papers, and Lyman Butterfield, director of the Institute of Early American History and Culture. The group met on a beautiful day in 1952 in the Stone Library in Quincy with the scent of roses that Abigail Adams had planted drifting in from the adjoining garden. The committee had come with the impression that they had been invited in order to offer advice, but they were in for a surprise. Instead, my father opened the meeting by making the announcement that the trustees had decided to donate the papers to the Massachusetts Historical Society as an unrestricted gift. And as Lyman Butterfield later noted, when Adams rose to tell us why we were there, it was at once apparent to my colleagues and me that all we were doing was breaking in an open door. The trustees had already made up their mind. And at this point, a well-conceived business plan was quickly put into place to make the papers accessible. They were microfilmed. The Harvard University Press agreed to publish them. Life magazine provided funding to start the project, and an editorial staff was put in place. And Leonard Tucker, who wrote the history of the Massachusetts Historical Society, has noted that in the history of the United States, there has never been a more significant collection of historical materials donated to a repository, public or private. While others were involved in the decision, one person can be particularly credited for this achievement, Thomas Boylston Adams. It was this donation that made possible Paul Nagel's great writing on the Addams family. And I might say that in many ways, this was also a blessing for the Addams family, rather like one of those lugubrious stories by Nathaniel Hawthorne, in which a terrible curse laid on a family for centuries is finally broken through some act of generosity or love. In the end, I think such a burden of papers in history was a genuine curse, a kind of quicksand of history which swallowed up the living members of the family. And it's been good not only for historians, but the family as well to make these papers published. Now, there was a side of Paul Nagel that was a bit like a shark, and like a good shark, he knew what to do when he smelled blood in the water. And remarkably, there was an almost perfect coincidence between a sort of turning point moment in Paul Nagel's career when he basically realized that he didn't want to spend the rest of his career as an administrator in the release of the Addams papers. And one of the interesting things about Paul Nagel's character, given the seeming mildness of his personality, is that his vision of what to do with these papers was extremely bold. He seems to have immediately sensed that he didn't want to just pick off a little piece of the Addams story. He wanted to tell the whole big four-generation story in all its sweep and scope. And he immediately also seems to have recognized that he was going to tell this story differently than the way it had been told by earlier scholars. Rather than stressing the political history, the diplomatic history, the political and public history, he was going to tell a family story, and he was going to explore that story's intimate aspects. Descent from Glory, to my knowledge, was the first book on the Addams family to fully take advantage of the Addams papers. And I think it's still the most complete, comprehensive history of the Addams family, including many members of the family that are usually left out. And one of the great contributions of the book is that it discreetly made use of medical knowledge that has developed greatly over the course of the 20th century, particularly an understanding of bipolar illness or manic depression and of alcoholism. And it's now known that both these illnesses have a very strong hereditary component, and in the case of the Adamses, they seem to have entered the family through Abigail Adams, who had a brother who showed huge talent and charm in his youth, but then degenerated into a wastrel and an alcoholic. And particularly in the early generations of the Addams family, alcoholism was a terrible scourge. John Adams's son, Thomas Boylston Adams, became an alcoholic, and John Quincy Adams's son, George Washington Adams, who was a figure of great talent and charm, became alcoholic, sired an illegitimate child, and finally committed suicide. And of course, alcoholism was not well understood in the 19th century, and I think that Paul astutely grasped that the sometimes rather ferocious side of Abigail Adams's character and her admonitions to her children to have a moral life were very much connected with her fear of the sort of fate that had overcome her brother. And of course, depression was even more pervasive, so much so that it might almost be described as an Adams characteristic, and it clearly has something to do with that ferocious Adams look that one can see so clearly in daguerreotypes of John Quincy Adams. I might just say that Paul's books are very dense. I just finished reading his account of my great-grandfather, Charles Francis Adams Jr., in Descent from Glory, and it's considerably more informative than the full-scale biography of Charles Francis Adams, which was written by a historian who I won't mention by name. And it's interesting because it goes rather ruthlessly into all his personal shortcomings and his business blunders, and yet it's also, I think, a very sympathetic treatment. Paul followed Descent from Glory with what in some ways is an even more remarkable book, The Adams Women, which explores the lives of a series of women in the family who generally get short shrift. Abigail, of course, gets much attention, but Paul Nagel explored the life of John and Abigail's daughter, Abigail, known as Nabby, who had an early romance with a dashing young gentleman named Royal Tyler, but because of her parents' concern about his recklessness, she instead married her father's personal secretary, William Smith. And in fact, Royal Tyler then went on to a very distinguished career, while Smith proved to be a wastrel and a mountebank. And Nabby had a thoroughly miserable existence, and her life was cut short by breast cancer, and she returned to the old house to die under her parents' roof. Surely the most fascinating figure is Louisa Catherine Adams, the wife of John Quincy, a woman of considerable talent and intellectual charm, who suffered through 5 miscarriages, was never very well treated by John Quincy Adams, who, for some peculiar psychological reason, never really treated her as an intimate or confidant as John Adams had with Abigail. And Paul found extraordinary statements in her writings, sort of proto-feminist statements. Here, she's complaining, man's interpretation of the word helpmate as used in the Bible means this: women made to cook his dinner, wash his clothes, gratify his sensual appetites, and thank him and love him for permission to drudge through life at the mercy of his caprices. Is this the interpretation intended by the Creator, the Father of all mercy? And she often clashed with Abigail, who naturally thought that Louisa wasn't nearly worthy of her wonderful and gifted son, John Quincy. But nonetheless, Louisa also wrote rather movingly that she hoped that Abigail's letters should somehow be published, since he prophesied that they would gladden the hearts of many a timid female whose rays too feebly shine, not for want of merit, but for one of confidence in their powers and encouragement in the exercise of those capacities with which the Almighty has gifted them. Many of the sex might thus redeem the reputation to which it is entitled, and by proving themselves equal to Mrs. Adams to practice all the virtuous and feminine duties, convince mankind that the native female mind, clear, full, and vigorous in its perceptions, is as capable of solid attainment and enlarged improvement as that of man. And Paul's final book returned to a central figure of the Addams family, John Quincy Adams, who had come across as not very sympathetic in the other two. It's sort of a nice twist that as the cover of the book, he chose a portrait by George Caleb Bingham, the Missouri painter who he also wrote a biography of. And John Quincy Adams was somewhat shifty as a politician. He was mean to his wife. He had a very acerbic, critical side. And I think that Paul makes him sympathetic through his willingness to talk about 2 dark topics. One is John Quincy Adams's struggle to escape the domineering strictures of his mother Abigail, and the other is that he clearly suffered from bipolar illness, which brought on depressions, which often virtually incapacitated him. In the 20th century, it seems to me that there have been 2 outstanding writers on the Addams family, David McCullough and Paul Nagel, and you see both of them here. Paul's on the left, and David McCullough looks like a politician who's seeking public office. Their work is intriguingly different, almost as different as the novels of Robert Louis Stevenson and Henry James. And in fact, sometimes one gets the feeling that they must have been writing about 2 different families. David McCullough is a wonderful storyteller and always gives things an upbeat spin. His book on John Adams is essentially a book about a hero who's all the more heroic because of many foibles and human weaknesses and his constant struggles to overcome them. It's the story of the ordinary man who becomes extraordinary through gumption and hard work, a great capacity for friendship, and a dedication to high ideals. And I think that McCullough wonderfully captures Adams's constant struggle for self-improvement, as well as his uniquely intense relationship with his wife, Abigail, and the way in which he overcame extraordinary obstacles to play a major role in the founding of the country. We feel that we've scaled a mountain by the time we reach the end. Paul Nagel's instincts as a storyteller are rather different. His books are not so much celebratory as thought-provoking and reflective. And when we get done, what we feel is not so much elation as a sort of sobering wisdom. As the title of Nagel's first book on the Addams family suggests, A Descent from Glory, Nagel's story has a tragic tinge. For one thing, he's not so much interested in a single heroic figure as in the complex web of family relationships, which is a more complicated matter. He's interested in the idea of a family saga which stretches through generations. And he's interested in how the achievements of John Adams and the intensity of his wife Abigail not simply became a source of inspiration, but also a sort of dark cloud that hung over the lives of his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, making them afraid that they did not measure up and constantly, anxiously reflecting on the family legacy, a tradition that finally culminated in the self-critical writings of that arch self-examiner, Henry Adams, who coldly stepped back to examine himself in the third person as if he were looking at himself through a microscope as a scientific specimen. Many of the things that are in the background of McCullough's story come to the foreground in Paul Nagel's story, the children who were alcoholic or had unhappy lives, and in particular, the female characters, people like John Quincy Adams's wife, Louisa Catherine. And also the insecurities that made the lives, even of the most successful members of the Addams family, desperately insecure. And I sometimes think that Paul Nagel must have been influenced by the Gestalt therapy movement, which developed in the 1940s and 50s and came to general awareness in the 1960s, which proposed that personal troubles should be examined not in relation to the isolated patient lying on the couch, but through the lens of interaction with others, particularly the members of a family. And in Paul Nagel's books, we're essentially looking at a whole family as a sort of complex organism in which successful lives are often achieved at the cost of disappointed lives somewhere else, and in which successes and public triumphs are offset by disappointments and tragedies of a more personal nature. It's not quite as bad as the House of Atreus, but it's definitely a story with some dark shadows. And I'm not sure that's something to be ashamed of. I think in the end, Paul's books provide the deepest of moral lessons that human achievements are not easy, that there's no such thing as a life without suffering and struggle. And in fact, it's an inspiring story, but in a complex way. And this leads finally to one of Paul's most remarkable achievements, which is that despite the seemingly unflattering picture that he presented of the Addams family, the various descendants of John Adams, such as me and my brothers, my parents, my cousins, without exception have immensely liked Paul's books, and they've liked him even more. I think at some level, the Adamses were probably relieved to have some of the dark shadows of the family history exposed. This is a Jacksonian broadside that always hung in my great-grandfather's office, which in turn was used by my grandfather and father. It basically shows John Quincy Adams horsewhipping a revolutionary soldier. The Adamses have always taken a certain relish in the negative things that were said about them. And I think that at some way, Paul Nagel, his work was a relief. It exploded the false illusion that the business of being an Adams was either pleasant or easy. And Paul was really the figure of Adams scholars who created the strongest relationship with living members of the Addams family. My father and mother always spoke of him with great affection, looked forward to every visit with him. And this wasn't unique. The artist Mary Abbott, whose mother was an Adams, was equally fond of him. And when she died, she left him a curious bequest of a sacred Adams object, Henry Adams's hat. And just why you would want to have Henry Adams's hat is beyond me, but you obviously don't leave it to anyone, only to an intimate friend and to someone who understood the family in a special way. So not only as a writer and scholar, but as a living human being, Paul bonded with the Addams family in a very unique way. When I last saw him, I had him inscribe a book for my son. As I say, I looked forward to having him meet in person with my wife and son. In the end, my wife did get to meet him after a fashion. He once called the house when I wasn't around, and she talked to him for fully an hour, and at the end of the conversation, they agreed that they'd get together soon. Well, of course, he became very ill very shortly after that. But anyway, I think he'll remain a source of inspiration to us through his books. And my son Tommy, again, you can see the Adams creativity with names. But anyway, I think that Paul Nagel will be, it's certainly in his writings will be an inspiration to him, for many years to come. So thank you very much. And I guess I've probably talked too long, but I can take a few questions.
Thank you. I enjoyed everything you said. Do you ever pinch yourself and think, oh my gosh, I'm related to these people?
Well, thank you. There's someone up here, I think. Oh.
What did you think of the HBO special on the Adamses?
I thought it was pretty good. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't see the whole thing, but my wife and Tommy watched it all the way through, and they greatly enjoyed it. I've got to confess that. How would I say? For me, having known actual members of the Addams family, there's often something about these film things that's just a little bit not right. But I think they were very well done. I think that Anthony Hopkins in Amistad does a wonderful job. I have some criticisms of the movie. It's funny because he doesn't even look that much like John Quincy Adams, but he somehow created an image that I think was quite effective.
I've been reading the book First Family about the letters between John Adams and Abigail, and I feel I get a much more of a description of their personal relationship. Were you particularly affected by the letters, or do you feel you got to know your predecessors more in other ways?
I think that set of letters is particularly wonderful, and sort of all the things the Adamses have written, I think that set of letters and then the education of Henry Adams are sort of the two bookends to the Addams family and are quite extraordinary. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You must have some extraordinary family reunions. Do they happen? And
yeah.
What are they like?
There's a reunion every year at the old house in Quincy, and I've got to confess I haven't gone too regularly. Actually, when I was there for the award for Paul, it was the first time I'd been there in many years. But yeah, it is always slightly spooky to see all those Adamses together. there are aspects of it that are sort of amusing. Just for example, John Adams left a fairly large sum of money to create a school in Quincy, something called the Adams Academy, which eventually folded, and the money was left to the Quincy public schools. And one of the clauses of this bequest was that if the money was ever spent improperly, that it would revert to the eldest male descendant of John Adams. And in fact, it turned out that a few years ago, the mayor of Quincy diverted the funds for some other purpose, so that this sum of money sort of ended up in a court case, and it would have reverted to my eldest brother, John. Again, you'll notice creativity with names. But then he had to fill out papers, turning it back to the Quincy schools if they ever do manage to find out what happened to it. So,
I'm curious about your pronunciation of President John Adams' wife's name. What's the understanding on that?
Oh, I tend to sort of, that's probably some strange New England pronunciation, but I tend to sort of shorten it all. Abigail.
My question is about the Adams of the Adams Tavern, who was famous in the period of the Revolutionary period in the Boston area. Is there a connection between your family and this other Adams?
I think there is, but I don't know exactly what it is. And at the old house in Quincy, they've got a very thorough Addams family genealogy. And I might say the Adams I didn't mention is Sam Adams, who I think was John Adams's first cousin. And yeah, when you get into all the descendants, there are quite a few of them.
Please join me in thanking our speaker this evening.
Yeah.
And we have a reception outside, so please join us out in the atrium. Thank you. That's great.
Oh, thank you.